There are many examples of infamous people in history. Lots of famous people, but there are lots of examples of infamous people too. And I think for a while there was a temptation, there was a possibility that someone like Osama bin Laden or Saddam Hussein would be the people that people, when they think about a wicked person, always look back to. But by and large, when people, even today, talk about a wicked person or evil incarnate or just an evil, evil man, who generally do they talk about? Adolf Hitler, right? It doesn't even, it's right there. That is to people's consciousness, not just in America, but all over the world, that's the embodiment of evil. Adolf Hitler. He rose to power under a crippled Germany. He believed conspiracy theories, especially about the Jews. He believed in evolution and Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest. And he believed in the flawed idea of eugenics, that you need to weed out those lesser genes and lesser peoples to cull them so that you have the stronger races. He's most wicked not for conquering Europe. That would have been bad enough, but Napoleon did that, and he's somewhat revered. He's not vilified for conquering Europe or trying to, but for the Holocaust and the evils that came along with that, the unmitigated evil that he was working with. And there are many examples in history of the end of wicked people. Nero, for instance, a wicked man, killed himself after running for his life. There was no one there. His bodyguards all abandoned him. He had no one to turn to. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he found himself running through the streets of Rome looking for anyone who would help him, and no one would. And he was so terrified and half crazy that he ended up committing suicide. Saddam Hussein, I remember when he was pulled out of a hole in hiding in Iraq, and they took him in after a military court, found him guilty of crimes against his country and hung him. Years ago, I read a book about the French Revolution, read about Maximilien Robespierre, who was the one who signed the death warrants of thousands of Frenchmen and finally found himself, without a trial, executed by guillotine. And we all look at those examples and we say, see, the end of the wicked, that's what it'll get you. And that's true. No, of course, it's not that only wicked people die. But isn't it true that when a righteous person dies, they're revered? They're a martyr or they're a hero. And we even build monuments and think about them on the day of their death. You know, so many years ago, this person died a hero. We don't remember generally when wicked people die. We're just glad that they did. And that is, in a nutshell, what Bildad is going to tell Job. Now, Job has been accused of being wicked by his friends since the beginning. In chapter 5, Eliphaz said, I'm paraphrasing, "You're being chastened and chastised for being too wicked. Don't despise the chastening of the Lord. Repent, because you're very wicked." Bildad, back in chapter 8, said, God would fight for you if you were righteous, but he's fighting against you. It must be that you're wicked. In chapter 11, Zophar said, you're complaining a lot, but you're actually getting less than what you deserve because of your great wickedness. And then that was the first round. The second round, they came out even stronger. Eliphaz said in chapter 15, why don't you just admit that you're wrong? Why don't you just admit your wickedness? Just come clean with the Lord. And now Bildad, in his second speech, is going to be even more condemning than he was in his first one. In any of these Psalms, or any of these chapters back and forth, Job or his friends, they always start with an insult. So let's read the insult first. Verse 1, then answered Bildad the Shuhite and said, how long will it be ere ye make an end of words? Mark, and afterwards we will speak. Wherefore are we counted as beasts and reputed vile in your sight? He teareth himself in his anger. Shall the earth be forsaken for thee? Shall the rock be removed out of his place? Let me break this down a little bit. Verse number 2, how long will it be ere ye make an end of words? When will you please shut up? That's what it means. Could you please stop talking? Could you please just be done, Job? Mark an end of when you're going to stop talking so that you can hear from the real wise people. He says, why are you counting us as beasts? Why are you looking at us and our advice like you're talking to some animal? We're the wise ones. We know what we're talking about. He notes in verse number 4 that Job is tearing himself in anger. Oh, you're really getting worked up about this, aren't you? Job, I feel like maybe you're protesting a little too much for an innocent person. He says, do you think the earth should be forsaken for this? Should all the laws of physics, should everything that we know, should we just make a bunch of exceptions for you, Job, because you're so righteous? Is that what you think? You're the exception? All the things we've said about a wicked person suffering, and you think that you're the exception? Should the earth be moved for you? Shall the rock be removed out of its place because you think you're the exception? So he's trying to get Job's attention. Again, over and over again, we have these insults that start off the chapters. And then he brings his thesis. Verse number 5 is kind of the key verse. Yea, the light of the wicked shall be put out, and the spark of his fire shall not shine. In Oriental culture, Far East culture, the idea of a light being put out was synonymous with not just death, but total and utter destruction. I'm told that they would have a light going on in their tent at all times, and that to a Bedouin or to some of these people that were living there in tents, that it would be easier for them to refuse food than to refuse fuel for their lamp, because it was so important that the lamp light was on. And what Bildad is saying, we all know that the wicked, that their end is total darkness and destruction. Their light is put out and they are done. Now, this is directed at Job. We understand that what he's going to say is generally true for wicked people. Not for everyone, and certainly not for Job, because the whole book starts off, no, Job was a perfect man. He was one that was righteous and feared God and eschewed evil. So he wasn't the wicked person. But Bildad has this little box where he says, well, good grief, all I know is that God destroys the wicked and you're being destroyed. You connect the dots. So we're not ready to connect those dots, but we should look at what Bildad says, because what he says about somebody else, and generally, is true. Listen to what the Expositor's Bible says about this. It is the most trenchant attack the sufferer has to bear. The law of retribution is stated in a hard, collected tone, which seems to leave no room for doubt. The force that overbears and kills is presented rather as fate or destiny than as moral government. No attempt is made to describe the character of the man on whom punishment falls. We hear nothing of proud defiance or the crime of settling in habitations under the divine curse. Bildad ventures no definitions that may not fit Job's case. He labels a man godless, and then with a dogged relish follows his entanglement in the net of disaster. All he says is general, abstract. Nevertheless, the whole of it is calculated to pierce the armor of Job's supposed presumption. What he's saying is true, generally. It's not true of Job, and it's not true of every wicked person. Because I named Nero and Saddam Hussein and Robespierre and Hitler, but you know that Joseph Stalin lived to be a nice old age. Pol Pot got to die, yes, under house arrest, but really only being arrested maybe less than a year, and then he died of cancer. All kinds of wicked men got to peacefully say goodbye to their grandchildren on their deathbeds, and will continue to do so. It's not true of every single wicked person. It's also just good for us to look at this and say, this is generally the way that wickedness goes. Now, let's not let anyone tell us that live an evil life, live a good life, doesn't matter. So Bildad is going to talk about the wicked person and their end, and I think it's good for us to learn about it, because he says in verse 6, the light shall be dark in his tabernacle, and his candle shall be put out with him. The wicked are going to die, and what are the other repercussions of a wicked life? So first of all, the wicked man feels trapped in his sin. Bildad says that the noose will tighten around his neck. Verse 7, The steps of his strength shall be straightened, and his own counsel shall cast him down. The steps will be straight. The word straight there doesn't mean like straight. It means narrowed, that his steps will be narrowed. And many of the commentators looked at this like what they would often do in hunting parties, where they would kind of fan out and they would be around the prey, and then they would just kind of close it in either with nets, or they would have kind of a narrow place where they would put a bunch of snares and traps and things like that. And then the people would just kind of make it harder and harder for the prey, whatever it was, deer or something, to get away. They would kind of just enclose it, and it would get smaller and smaller. And that's what he's saying happens to the wicked. The wicked, the steps of his strength shall be straightened, and his own counsel shall cast him down. Verse 8, for he is cast into a net by his own feet, and he walketh upon a snare. The gin shall take him by the heel, and the robber shall prevail against him. The snare is laid for him in the ground, and a trap for him in the way. This is the way of the wicked. They're trapped in their own sin. Any traps that he set for himself will come back and get him. And his destruction will come suddenly at the hands of other robbers. Like someone who's been robbed, that's how quickly your destruction will come. Verse number 10, while running, he'll not see the trap, and he'll fall right into it. This is the end of the wicked. This is true of Hitler. He felt the circle getting smaller and smaller. He started to lose ground in Europe, especially as the United States grabbed a foothold there in Normandy and on those beaches in northern France, and were able to start putting supplies and soldiers, both theirs and some of the other Allied troops, onto the beaches. And they started to come through France, and then they finally made their way into Germany. And then Russia started pushing back from the east, and Hitler felt his grasp on Europe getting smaller and smaller. The generals started to plan his demise to save Germany from destruction. They could see that it would be better to save Germany than to try to win this war. It would be better to surrender, and Hitler was having none of it, so they actually tried to kill him on a few different occasions. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was even involved in some of those plots. They had a suitcase bomb that just didn't go off. They had another suitcase bomb that went off, but it went off on the under the table, too far away from Hitler to kill him. So over and over again, this noose was getting smaller and smaller. And because of that, he became more paranoid. The public stopped listening to him. The public stopped caring about what he had to say. And all of that grandeur and all of the people clamoring for his words dried up. Eventually, the conspiracy theories that Hitler believed became his undoing. It was those radical theories that kept him on in the war. If it had been for money, if it had been for land, if it was just about Poland, he probably could have gotten away with quite a bit more, but it was those conspiracy theories that he believed, where he, to the very end, thought that he was the winner and the Jews were getting this wicked victory against him because he was losing the war. We've seen this happen in others as well, haven't we? Those who speak badly of others get spoken badly of themselves. The wicked try to ensnare others in their words, and it comes back to them. They who cheat, they get caught up in it, and they can't stay ahead of it. Years ago, there was a man named Bernie Madoff who decided to get in secret investors to come in, and it was all kind of by invitation. And then he would pay out dividends, but he would pay out dividends not because he was investing his money wisely, but because other people were investing, and he would take that money and give it out to people, so that kind of built the hype of, oh man, I'm getting some great returns. And that all went well, but even Bernie Madoff said, and I couldn't lie enough, I couldn't cheat enough to stay ahead of all of it. And in 2008, when the Enron deal fell and everybody wanted their money back, they realized he doesn't have it anymore. What was it, $65 billion that were lost in that whole scheme, that whole Ponzi scheme? We've seen that happen. The wicked who gossip, all of a sudden now it gets back to them later. Or like we said 2 weeks ago, nobody wants to believe them anymore. Nobody wants to be their friend because it's like, oh, it's one thing when you're telling me about somebody else, but I don't want to be on the other end of that news. So all of a sudden now the wicked, those traps that they set for somebody else, it comes back on them. Those who lie are lied to. In Family Sunday School, we're talking about Jacob, and Jacob tricks his brother, tricks his father. He's trying to, weasel his way into it, and then he meets Laban. And, he meets the master trickster. He gets tricked out of the wife that he wants into marrying 2 women. He gets tricked out of his wages. We're going to read about that this week in Family Sunday School. But over and over again, Jacob, the guy that, is trying to scheme his way, gets schemed. And that's the way of the wicked. You get into that, and that's what you're going to live by. Those who hang out with criminals, nobody's surprised when you hear about a drug deal gone bad. Nobody really feels bad for people that this thing happened because they were doing bad things with bad people. And we're all like, oh, who could have seen that coming? I mean, we have compassion maybe a little bit, but it's also like, well, what did you think was going to happen? You hang out with these kinds of people that are violent, and you're doing violence against other people, and what do you think is going to happen to you? We all see this, the wicked, right? So I think this points to the fact that there's an inherent trickiness and hiddenness to sin. I've said this before, but Satan very often shows us the showroom of sin is beautiful. It's wonderful to look at. You go into Satan's showroom and sin looks great. Oh, that's what I want. I want that. What he doesn't show you is what happens when you walk into the building. Sin always looks like it's a great deal, but on the other end, you're trapped. And isn't there a certain element of that? Every time you sin, isn't there like do you feel like very seldom do you sin with all your faculties? Yes, I know that this will be the end of sin, and I'm still choosing that. Isn't it true that generally when you choose to sin, you imagine it going differently? Oh, I'm going to say this about this other person, and they're really going to come clean, or they're really going to hear what I'm saying, and it doesn't go that way. I'm going to put this out there, and it's going to get back, and it's going to go well for me. No, it's not. I'm going to get some kind of advantage. Nope. I'm going to, whatever it is, I'm going to do this thing, and it's going to go well. Well, there's an inherent trickiness, there's an inherent hiddenness to sin. And the idea of a snare implies that you don't see it coming until it's too late. Numbers 32, verse 23 says, be sure your sin will find you out. That will happen, that eventually your sin will come looking for you. The consequences of your sin will come. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but isn't it great to have a Savior who forgives? That's wonderful. But let's not forget the inherent trickiness, the inherent deceit of sin. And he talks about this. The wicked, they're going to be in sin, and they're not even going to see the end coming. Then he says, second, the wicked will be in terrors and will die. Bildad paints a picture of the wicked man who's full of terror. Verse 11, terrors shall make him afraid on every side and shall drive him to his feet. His strength shall be hunger-bitten, and destruction shall be ready at his side. It shall devour the strength of his skin. Even the firstborn of death shall devour his strength. His confidence shall be rooted out of his tabernacle, and it shall bring him to the king of terrors. It shall dwell in his tabernacle because it is none of his. Brimstone shall be scattered upon his habitation. His roots shall be dried up beneath, and above shall his branch be cut off. This is a description of the wicked. Verse 11, fear will make him take to running away. Verses 12 and 13, he'll lose strength. Verses 14 and 15, fear will live in his tent like a wild animal. It'll always be with him. In verse 16, he'll be like a dying tree. His roots are dried up, and the top branches where he could get the nutrients from the sun, all of it's been cut off. That is what the wicked is like. He's in terrors, and he will die. And again, we see that same thing in history when we think about Hitler. He became more and more paranoid. Goring, one of his generals, heard that that Hitler was going to commit suicide and asked to take over. And Hitler assumed that he was trying a coup and fired him and threatened to kill him. The guy that said, I'd like to take over when you're gone because I heard you're going to commit suicide. He said, oh, you'd like to take over, would you? Well, you're fired. And if you don't watch it, I'll have you killed. He heard that Himmler had already been negotiating through back channels about surrendering to the Allied forces. And Hitler was so mad that he had the SS secretary shot. Not Himmler, but Himmler's ambassador and representative. He had him shot because he became more and more paranoid of what was going to happen. And to the end, again, blamed the Jews for the war, especially losing it. There is security in truth. You don't have fear and terror when there's truth. And this is true at home, right? Isn't it true? You have to go somewhere where it's dark. You hear something out in your backyard, and you're like, well, let's go check and see what this is. And maybe you take some protection with you. But if it was day, you wouldn't. If it's day, you go out there and you're like, oh, look, it's this thing that I stacked these up badly and they fell over, and that's what that was. But when it's night, that there's that obscurity. Truth takes away fear, and when we don't know, then we become afraid. And when we're afraid, we sometimes act irrationally. Remember, we had a bat in our house, and not the house we just had, but the house before. And I read a little bit of how to deal with bats. And for those of you who love animals, just understand that bats are not animals. They're demons, so it's okay for me to kill it. But so bats have to drop before they fly. And so what you do is you put a little bucket of water underneath them, and then you kind of tap them, and they go like they're going to drop, and they just drop into the water, right? And then you can kill them. Well, I didn't know enough about bats, but I knew that. So I put them in this bucket of water, and I put it out in the garage, and I'm like, well, now what do I do? I do this thing. I'm like, do I just let it sit there all day and drown? That doesn't seem nice, And it's just like, what if it bites me? What if it comes after me? Whatever. So I'm like, well, maybe I can kind of do something else with it. Maybe I can let it go somewhere else. And so I took the lid off, and it started scrambling around, and I kind of panicked, and I dropped the bucket on the ground, and the bat was on the ground, and I didn't know what to do. So I did what any rational person would do. I grabbed a broom and beat it until the broom broke. I probably wouldn't do that now. It's just a bat. I could probably step on it or do... What? Okay. I thought you were going to say, no, don't kill it. They're beautiful and they eat mosquitoes. Okay, good. Well, that's good. Yeah. Yeah. Get a hockey stick, right? I actually knocked one out of the sky with a pillow, which you're not supposed to do because, you need the tennis racket because they don't see it coming. Anyway, all that to say, the more you know about something, the less afraid you are of it. It's just a bat. It's not going to bite you. It's more afraid of you, and they're tiny. They're not fun, but at least the more you know, the less scared you are. But there's a security in truth. To sin is to dwell in lies. You're fighting against reality in your sin. And so, of course, if you're in sin, you're going to take away the hope and the peace that you could have. There are all kinds of pleasant consequences to doing right. Now, again, it doesn't mean that every time you do right, things go well. Ask a martyr the consequences of doing right, but it's worth it. And it's interesting, even martyrs at the end of their life have no fear of death. So many wonderful stories of people that have gone to their death as Christians with no fear. The normal person is terrified. I can't believe how many people, they commit some crime and they say, I don't want the death penalty. And it's like, well, if you're going to be in prison the rest of your life, for me, I would just rather have it. But they have no security of what's on the other side. So, of course, that makes sense to them, that the wicked would be terrified of death, terrified of the future. I'm not worried about the future. If I found out I die at midnight tonight, I would take care of things, but I wouldn't be terrified. Why? Because there's been security and hope and peace given to me. There's been forgiveness through Christ. There's security in truth and in righteousness. And when you don't have that, all you have is fear. That's why he's talking about this. I think even sinners realize this to some extent. They fear at least the consequences of their actions. Proverbs 28:1 says, the wicked flee when no man pursueth, but the righteous are bold as a lion. Let me encourage you, when you sin, don't let Satan lie about the way to resolve that. You sin, and Satan says, well, what you have to do is sin more in order to make sure that this gets taken care of. And what God says is, no, bring it to the light. Confess it to me, tell me, and agree with me, and I'll forgive you, and I'll bring you into the right way, and I'll teach you the real truth about sin. Rely on his help to overcome it, and he'll take away the terrors that accompany sin. In 2 Timothy 1, verse 7, it says, for God hath not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. That's what we're looking for, that sound mind. And Bildad's right. The wicked are terrified. They're so afraid of their consequences, even if they won't admit it. It's amazing how many people, I'll do a ride-along with an officer, and they say they can always tell the people that are up to something because they drive perfectly. 10 and 2, like this. The only thing that might be different is they kind of put their head back so that you can't see through the window. Their kind of head is behind that little panel there. And that's just, but they're just very trying to obey every law because they know what they're doing is wrong. And there's this idea that is just going to follow you. You've done the wrong thing. There's Satan, and he's going to hide the effects, but you can't get away from the fear of the consequences. Then finally, Bildad talks about the legacy of the wicked. The legacy of the wicked will be lost. Posterity is probably more important to them than it is to us. You know, I kind of like the idea that there might be generations of Hawns and that name might mean something to somebody someday. I like that idea, but it's not so important to me that if I'd had all girls, I would have been like, no, right? It's just like a name to us isn't as big a deal as it was to them. But the idea of having a lasting impact, I think, is important to all of us, that we look to our children, our grandchildren, and hope that they speak well of us to our great-grandchildren and our great-great-grandchildren, and there would be something to be said for the impact that we have, that it wasn't just 70 and off the planet, but that there would be something good, some impact, like we talked about with Jeannie, that would mean something afterward. Not so for the wicked. Verse 17, his remembrance shall perish from the earth, and he shall have no name in the street. He shall be driven from the light into darkness and chased out of the world. He shall neither have son nor nephew among his people, nor any remaining in his dwellings. They that come after him shall be astonished at his day, as they that went before were affrighted. In verse number 17, he's going to have no name. Albert Barnes in his commentary says this, quote, it is one of the rewards of virtue that the good will speak of the upright man when he is dead, that they will pause in their journey or in their business to converse about him, and that the poor and needy will dwell with affectionate interest upon their loss. This blessing, Bildad says, will be denied the wicked man. The world will not feel that they have any loss to deplore when he is dead. No great plan of benevolence has been arrested by his removal. The poor and the needy fare as well as they did before. The widow and the fatherless make no grateful remembrance of his name. The world hastens to forget him as soon as possible. Unquote. That is the way of the wicked. Verse 18, he'll be driven to darkness. There'll be no light left. And again, light was a big deal then. In verses 19 and 20, there will be no one who will take up his name or look after his things. It will be like he never lived, or worse. That's the way of the wicked. Hitler's name today is synonymous with evil. Many people who had the last name Hitler, his cousins and so forth, actually ended up changing their name. There's rumor that one family that moved to the United States not only changed their name, but vowed to never have children because they just wanted that whole line to be out. Everything belonging to him was burned and forgotten. He wanted to be remembered as a great leader, but now he's vilified as nothing and worse than nothing. To the point where even when someone says, you know, Hitler had some good points, everybody jumps on them and says, what are you talking about? He may have. Everybody has some kind of good points, but he was such a wicked man that any mention that he might have had something good to contribute is immediately vilified. Imagine, that is the end of the wicked. That's what Bildad says, of course, of Job. It's not true of him, but it is true of many of the wicked. People that when they're gone, everybody says, I'm glad. Death introduced into the human race seems like a curse, but when it comes to wicked people, I'm glad there's no immortality. I'm glad that these wicked people have an end at some point, because someone who's maybe not as wicked will come up after them and not keep on their wickedness. There is something in us that wants a part of us to live on. The wicked men don't have any kind of pedigree. Evil influence breeds death. They don't have anybody that they're discipling. I know people that go to prison, they generally get taught how to be better criminals. They come out and they're worse than they were before, but that's not the right kind of discipleship we're talking about, because even those end in wickedness and death. But a life of integrity and honesty and purity can be passed on well. If the wicked, are remembered at all, they're remembered as a warning. Don't be like them. Don't repeat their mistakes. I often go on websites to find quotes for my sermons. I'll go to Brainy Quote or other quote websites, and you just don't find a lot of wicked people being quoted because nobody wants to emulate their response, their commentary. Now, again, this is not by God's command. God does not say, we will not talk about the wicked. It's just the way that it shakes out. In secular society or otherwise, even the most atheistic person looks at a wicked person and says, let's not be like them. Let's not even talk about them in any kind of positive light. We want to have a more enduring substance than our children. We want to be remembered and thanked for our part in others' lives. We want to be able to bring to heaven as many people as we can through our witness and gospel. The wicked, they'll be cut off. They'll be in terror. They'll be ensnared. Let that be a warning to us. Bildad got it wrong about Job, but it's not wrong about the wicked and the way of the wicked. Let us as Christians remember that bad example. Let's pass by the vineyard of the wicked, not the slothful, but the vineyard of the wicked, and say, let's endeavor to not be that. Verse 21 sums it all up. Surely such are the dwellings of the wicked, and this is the place of him that knoweth not God. Well, Bildad, you got it wrong about Job, but let's all say amen.